פשוט לא שמעתי מה זה.
תשמע, אתה צריך להבין, לא, אי אפשר לזרוק ככה סיסמאות בלי ללמוד. הדיבר לא תרצח, הוא רק כלפי...
About the German case is that Germany is so far the only country in the world that had long-standing colonies and was participating in colonialism and slavery, which was at some point held responsible by Western forces for a genocide that it committed in Europe, but not outside of it.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to the Struggle Video News. Religious Zionism. On the one hand, it's the name of a coalition of fascist parties that banded together in Israel's last election. But more importantly, it's the name for a movement that's infected a lot of Israeli political parties. It differs from the fascism based on purely security needs that Netanyahu represents. Religious Zionism is connected up to the April 3rd police and army riot inside Al-Aqsa Mosque. There's a 32-second video of this violence, of soldiers beating people unmercifully with gun butts and batons. To prevent us from being censored, we'll just show 8 still photos. No yelling. You can see the full video on many places in Twitter. Look especially for the Twitter feed IMEU. Scenes like this are covered by corporate media saying that at protests, clashes or violence broke out. So what exactly happened at Al-Aqsa? I told you last week about those Israelis who want to bring goats up to the Al-Aqsa compound to sacrifice them. They want to build an altar there, kill the goats, sprinkle their blood on the altar, and then burn all of them as a sacrifice to the Almighty. Their larger purpose is to demolish the Al-Aqsa Mosque and replace it with a Jewish temple and to have constant animal sacrifices. According to Nir Hassan, writing in Haaretz, to them, quote, "The Passover sacrifice is the most important Jewish commandment, and every year there is a small but determined group which tries to ascend to the Temple Mount with a sacrificial goat." They've been doing this for years, but with Ben-Gvir now in charge of Israeli police, Ben-Gvir, who was one of their supporters, Muslims fear that the Israelis might succeed in their idiocy. So several hundred Muslims stayed inside a building on the Al-Aqsa compound after prayers, and then the police attacked. I must point out that this religious Zionism cult that sees animal sacrifice as the pinnacle of religion is something totally alien to the vast majority of Jews. About Ben-Gvir, someone on Twitter released a video of him from several decades ago speaking on an Israeli TV program. Please read the subtitles.
כל שבוע אנחנו שומעים על עוד יהודי שנרצח ועוד יהודי שנרצח. נמאס, סוף סוף קם יהודי גדול, הצדיק הדוקטור גולדשטיין, השם יקום דמו.
אני לא מבין את התופעה הזאת פה,
אל תפריע לי.
ואתה אומר גדול, אין שום אפשרות לאדם שרצח לקרוא גדול.
אני מבקש ממך, אל תפריע לי, הוא רצח. גם דוד רזיאל, גיבור של האצ"ל והלח"י, גם הגיבורים של האצ"ל, וגם הגיבורים של הלח"י, וגם האנשים של ההגנה, הרגו.
וכנראה שלא שמעתם על הדיבר, לא תרצח. פשוט לא שמעתי מה זה.
תשמע, אתה צריך להבין, לא, אי אפשר לזרוק ככה סיסמאות בלי ללמוד. הדיבר לא תרצח, הוא רק כלפי יהודים. וככה אמר הרמב"ם, וככה אמר הרמב"ם,
וככה אומר שליטה, הסתה לרצח, מה שאתה עושה כאן.
איתמר, באמת אפרופו הסתה לרצח. הרבה, בזמן האחרון נשמעו הרבה התבצעויות מצד ראשי כך. בנושא אלימות, אתה חושב שזו הדרך באמת לפתור את הבעיה הפלסטינאית בארץ.
המצע של תנועת כך קורא למדינה יהודית. הפתרון של הנושא, של הבעיה, הסכסוך הערבי-היהודי, הוא לגרש ערבים לערב ויהודים לציון.
מה כך יעשו במידה והמתנחלים באמת יפונו מחברון?
אנחנו כתנועה לא ניתן וננקוט בכל האמצעים כדי שלא יפונו יישובים.
כולל לשפוך דם?
אנחנו ננקוט בכל האמצעים שלא יפונו.
כולל לשפוך דם?
ננקוט בכל האמצעים כדי שלא יפנו את חברון.
האם במקרה שיפנו את חברון או את שער ישע, אתה וחבריך תרימו נשק נגד חיילי צה"ל?
אני חושב שאם יפנו את יישובים של יהודה, שומרון ועזה, יישפך דם.
שפך דם. זאת אומרת, אתה גם לא תציית לחוק.
יישפך דם.
לא תציית לחוק.
יש חוק יהודי, יש דבר שנקרא חוק יהודי והוא מעל הכל. והחוק היהודי אומר שיהודה, ששומרון, שעזה זה ארץ ישראל, זה חלקי ארץ ישראל, ולא ייתכן שממשלה שמאלנית בוגדנית.
Ben-Gvir starts off talking about his hero Goldstein, who killed 29 Muslim worshippers in Hebron in 1994. Later he says the phrase "does not kill" is only for Jews, meaning that the only prohibition on murder is that Jews should not kill other Jews. He claims his authority for this is from Rambam, a Jewish scholar of 900 years ago. The video is from decades ago, but I don't think there's any evidence that Ben-Gvir has changed any of his views. Here's a brilliant meme from the Israeli group Breaking the Silence with a Passover holiday theme. It's a criticism of the democracy movement in Israel that is trying to defeat Netanyahu's attempted coup. On one side is the traditional matzah, but on the other there is the gray wall, the apartheid wall. The message is half free can't be freedom. There's a trial going on now in Britain. 6 people 2 years ago were arrested on their way to a factory of the Israeli weapons company Elbit. The charge is possessing an article with the intent to destroy property. Tony Greenstein, one of those arrested, wrote on his blog, "I shall of course be pleading not guilty to the charge of intending to destroy or damage property contrary to Section 3 of the Criminal Damage Act 1971. My intent was not to cause criminal damage, but to prevent war crimes being committed." Palestinian-American lawyer and activist Huwaida Arraf of Michigan spoke at Bloomfield Hills High School in that state during a diversity week in mid-March. She spoke at 4 sessions. Students asked her questions and all went well as far as she knew. But the next day she was viciously attacked, ferociously attacked by Zionist interests in that state. The Jewish Community Relations Council and the American Jewish Committee released a statement decrying Arraf as a known anti-Israeli activist who had over the course of the day increased, quote, her anti-Israel rhetoric, unquote, and had made, quote, Jewish students, many of whom were in attendance, extremely uncomfortable, unquote. The principal, who had agreed to her presentation, also criticized her, saying she had gone beyond, quote, agreed parameters in her talk. But evidently that was not enough for the Zionist, who got the school board to humiliate the principal. He was suspended. An article in the Jewish News Syndicate went further. Its headline was, "A Michigan high school deliberately traumatized Jewish students. It branded Huwaida Arraf as anti-Semitic, but never quoted one word she said in any of her presentations. The writer of the article, who heads the Michigan branch of the Zionist Organization of America, instead wrote about her leadership in the Gaza Freedom Flotilla and painted a picture of that effort in the darkest of colors. Now, that all took place in 2010, so it's ancient history, but I remember that well. A collection of boats and ships that May tried to break the infamous siege of Gaza, hoping to bring in humanitarian goods. The main ship, called the Mavi Marmara, had all of its cargo completely inspected, as were all those on board, by Turkish officials, including X-ray checks, before the ship left port in Istanbul. In the article in the Jewish News Syndicate, there was this breathtaking lie. It complained about a, quote, unprovoked attack on the Israeli weapons inspectors who boarded the flotilla, unquote. That's an amazing collection of untruths in just one small sentence. There were no Israeli weapons inspectors. Instead, there was an attack by Israeli military commandos who boarded and seized the ship, killing 9 on board immediately. 1 died later. 2 had been shot from above before any of the commandos even rappelled down onto the ship. Commandos stole personal property. Credit cards were charged for beer, etc. in Israel weeks later. The Gaza Freedom Flotilla was a brave effort, and condemning Arraf for helping organize it is despicable. A letter has been composed, signed by many organizations, defending Huwaida Arraf. About 20 members of the clergy also signed it, about half of whom were rabbis. More needs to be done, though, including pointed condemnations of the Jewish establishment leaders in this country who support the religious Zionist government of Israel. Now, a bit of the talk by German-Palestinian Younes, who spoke at the Palestine Museum US in mid-March. She was asked about Germany and why the government there won't allow a significant criticism of Israel or acts of solidarity with Palestinians.
So even within that narrative of seemingly feeling bad about the Holocaust, not only leaves out historically an even older German genocide, so it refocuses a European history again, and then only a particular people within that European history. So Sinti and Roma have almost as, equally been wiped out as Jews, or at least Eastern European Jews in that moment, like European Jewry has, but we very much don't talk about it in the same manner. So it's not, what I'm trying to say is, it's talking about historical injustices does not impede foreign politics about race and racism. What does impede politics, or kind of inverses the politics, is when you use it as a window dressing moment where you don't really mean it. If as far as I can tell, white US Americans that have been here for the longest time, they're not as incapable of ruling their country because they feel bad about genocide and racial slavery? I haven't heard that narrative. I think what is quite interesting about the German case is that Germany is so far the only country in the world that had long-standing colonies and was participating in colonialism and slavery, which was at some point held responsible by Western forces for a genocide that it committed in Europe, but not outside of it.
That's a really interesting point that you raised.
And that is something
this whole colonial era, colonial legacy is somehow, manifestation of the past, and that, now, of course, there are many countries around the world who were victims of that period and remain affected to this day, who are asking for acknowledgement, the return of artwork, for example, and lots of other demands. So I do see where you're coming from on that. That somehow
sure, we're not just talking about art, like that's not just. I don't want to.
No, I know. I just mentioned that because that's just like, of course, it goes way beyond that.
That's like the tipping point, right? When you go to the British Museum and you see all these wonderful artifacts from Iraq, and then it says, "Oh, we're rescuing it from
right.
war." Yeah, well, you bombed that country for the last 30 years, and now you're rescuing it from its own people, seemingly. I think, but that is, so that's kind of like the typical colonial trope, right? What I'm trying to say is that Germany has mobilized this narrative that it was actually forced to look at its genocide within Europe, right? Has mobilized that as a means to detract from not only its colonial history, because what happens with this anti-Semitism detoured conversation that we're having, which is not again about anti-Semitism actually, because there are white Germans who are telling Jews today what it means to be a Jew. We ended up in a situation where the German state again tells Jews what a real Jew is supposed to be and think. Right? So this is not about Germans learning anything from the past. I think if they would have learned anything from the past, they would be a little bit more cautious about that. The people who are running the anti-Semitism policies today are predominantly Protestant white Germans. And it's not like they're sitting, that they're inviting the Jewish community to ask them about their opinion. They are.
So is this about, and again, forgive me for my language, I'm
sure.
just going to say it, is Germany washing its hands of its past atrocities?
Right, I think that's where the relationship to the war on terror comes in. I think this is how the United States of America manages to wash its hands of its other colonial atrocities as well, right? We need to find in decolonial times where it's not in anymore, and to support colonialism, settler colonialism, and or / apartheid. We can't think apartheid without settler coloniality or colonialism, or slavery even, actually, historically speaking. It's like to even separate these categories, even if that's important in front of the law, historically it doesn't make any sense. But right now we are at a time in history where at least governments and universities and public intellectuals say that, unless you're a right-wing fascist, that settler coloniality or colonialism, slavery, as well as apartheid is not good anymore. We have progressed from that stage, right? So once we are semantically in a world where everybody is supposedly progressive, but yet we continue with the same economic and political systems, then we need to reframe these systems in a very Orwellian scenario where war becomes peace and peace becomes war.
I thought you made a great point. German authorities are not suddenly bending over backwards for all those whom Germany has wronged. It doesn't tell Germans about its genocide of black Africans in what was once its colony of Southwest Africa. German government attitudes have much more to do with the German role in the U.S. imperial bloc, which, as we know, excuses Israeli apartheid. The last reminder of our Courage Award ceremony at Central at 3 p.m. this Thursday, April 13th, to honor jailed Egyptian Alaa Abd el Fattah. See thestruggle.org for details. Before we talk about Ukraine, mention of an article I wrote for the Connecticut Mirror about gas-powered lawn equipment. We need to find some Connecticut legislators who will restore Senate Bill 1165. See peace.org for details. Now more of the webinar about Ukraine from Veterans for Peace for Ukraine.
First, good evening.
Good midnight.
Hey, the title of this webinar is it's confused a lot of people. It's called "Can Russia's invasion of Ukraine be rationalized or even justified by Western expansionism?" And that's a mouthful. And it was my bright idea for that title. And apparently everybody hates it. But I picked that title because it's been about 400 days now since the Russian Federation did the full-scale invasion of your country, and I'm pretty active on the left, and my interpretation of what I've heard from our left are basically rationalizations and justifications for Russia's invasion. I've heard NATO went back on its promises. I've heard about security red lines from Mr. Putin. You know, and I've heard a lot of that. Of course, I've also heard about Nazis. I've heard about fascists, a whole entire army of Ukrainian fascists, the Azov Brigade, and so on and so forth as well. So I went out looking for a fellow leftist progressive, and I found you, a historian of Central and Eastern Europe, and I'm hoping you could answer some of those questions for me, and maybe somebody else learn something along with me.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just so surreal that main position on the left in the US that two imperialist countries, Russia and US, should strike a deal and divide Ukraine in some way, and that this is their anti-imperialism, and it's just awful to hear. And a lot of people just automatically took this position, automatically accept that for some reason Russia have any legitimate claims about Ukraine's sovereignty, so they can talk about, okay, NATO broke some promises to Russia, how it relates to Ukraine. Ukraine didn't have any promises to Russia that it broke, and it just it strikes me a lot how imperialist and close to, I don't know, to Trumpist Kissingerian style politics some on the left in the US become, and it's a real tragedy. But yeah, I want to start my speech with notion that some time ago on this month there was an important date of 20 years from the start of horrible invasion of US in Iraq, and all of this war on terror and all of that imperialism and war crimes that were happening in Iraq. And I think not much people know that not only US had war on terror, but also the same situation was in Russia. And even before the invasion of Iraq, there was an invasion to Chechnya Republic with the same rhetoric that Russia should fight terrorism, that they're all terrorists, that we need to just go there and prevent all this base of terrorism that just spreads all over Russia and so on and so on. And that was a pretext for first Chechen war that practically was waged by Russia and killed 8% of all the population of the country, of civilian population, of people who participate in popular resistance against Russian invasion. And all of this was happening by the same pretext as the invasion of America to Iraq, that we are fighting against terror, we are fighting against these terrorist people. Of course, they're all, majority of the people in Ichkeria in Chechen Republic were Muslim, so there was also this Islamophobia and all of this context. But what is important that this war, with the same claims that the war in Iraq, gave actually a lot of legal reasoning and possibility for US to actually push with Iraq, because they saw that, okay, Russia can invade, And Russia didn't have any international courts, any opposition from the human rights, strong opposition from the human rights movements or the governments of other countries. And that after they failed horribly, they still struck a peace deal that practically puts Russia in advantage. So this ignorance of invasion to Chechen Republic gave ground and gave more possibility, more weight for US then to wage war in Iraq. And with Russia waging its war against terrorism, they were pretty in alignment with American invasion of Iraq, and they were saying, okay, they're fighting terrorism too, so we need to support them or at least ignore this. And by the precedent of war on terror that was going on in Russia, there became a lot more ground for US to start to do their horrible war crimes. And this interconnectivity and intermotivations were actually very strong between Russian and American imperialism. Because after this, Russia broke any peace deals that it had with Chechen Republic and invaded it again. And on this time, this invasion was going until capitulation of Chechen Republic and complete occupation. And in this case, NATO countries actually cooperate with Russia. They sold them weapons. They supported them diplomatically. There is even a famous moment of Tony Blair visiting Russia in times of Second Chechen War, when Russian soldiers were mass killing Chechen civilians and bombing their countries, to negotiate a deal about trade of weapons, and to say that, okay, Russia have also their so-called terrorist problems that they need to deal with, and that West, at least not publicly, but should support Russia in waging this war.